Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Melissa DeRosa. Melissa, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Of course. And when Governor Andrew Cuomo, New York's governor, was in office, you were his number two, serving as his secretary during both the highs and the lows of his tenure. We'll get into both. But first, you wrote a book recently, What's Left Unsaid. Can you talk about why you wrote the book?
Absolutely. I decided I was going to write the book literally within 24 hours of us being out of office. I decided I was not going to let the first draft of history stand. The first draft of history was written by reporters, sort of through the fog of COVID, as I call it in the book, and was told by a lot of people who weren't in the room, non-primary sources, people with particular political motivations. There was a lot of politics going on during those 2 years. And so I told myself when I left that I was going to tell the story as someone who lived it, as someone who was there during the pandemic, being New York being ground zero globally, a once in a century pandemic, as someone who was on the phone fighting with Jared Kushner, in the White House dealing with Donald Trump, and then ultimately, dealing with scandal and being there as the administration unraveled. And so that was the purpose of the book. I wanted to let the public into the room, onto the phone, sort of living with me what those 2 insane years were, given the gravity of what they meant for everyone else. All of the different fallout from both the pandemic and from the government being overturned. So that was the purpose of the book.
When reading the book, it's almost like COVID seemed like yesterday and so far away, so long ago. And you really lift the curtain on what it was like serving in the Cuomo administration. And let's remember, Governor Cuomo at the beginning of the pandemic, he was America's governor. He was lauded as the nation's voice when it comes to COVID. You did mention that you had direct lines to the White House. You detail in the book your calls with Jared Kushner. Can you give our viewers one of your favorite anecdotes of that time?
Sure. I mean, I'm not sure it's my favorite anecdote per se, but I think something people will find really interesting, which was that in the summer of 2020, there was a spike in crime, as people may remember, all across the country. And Trump, I think, sort of decided in that moment that he thought that he could be commander in chief and he was going to send, the troops into all of these cities and deal with crime, and that it would resonate with suburban voters and it would help him electorally to look tough on crime, make democratic cities look weak. And we were in this period where, as I describe it in the book, it had been leaked to the press that they were thinking about sending troops into New York City. And I sort of go into panic mode because anyone who knows anything about New York City, particularly during those days, it was like a tinderbox, especially post George Floyd. It was like a tinderbox. And the one thing New Yorkers all agreed on was their disdain for Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump had sent federal troops into New York City during that time period, we believed it would have erupted. It would have been an unmitigated disaster. And so in the book, I sort of talk about, we're seeing these press reports, we don't know what's going on. And I go into the backyard of the mansion and I just start dialing every reporter I knew, people at the NYPD, people at the state police, people in Washington trying to figure it out. And then I just decide, screw it, time to go through the front door. And I pick up the phone and call Jared and he answers the phone. And as I detail in the book, we get into this sort of rough and tumble conversation back and forth that ends with the two of us screaming at each other, where he lets it be known on the phone that at a bare minimum, they were very seriously considering sending federal troops into New York. And I'm, yelling at him, people here hate you, you break it, you buy it, you do not want to do this. And he said, I hear you, Melissa, I got it. And we hung up the phone. And I was like, okay, I think we dodged this bullet. And I immediately tell the governor, and the next day, Trump releases the list of cities that he's sending troops into. New York is not on it. And as I say in the book, the governor picks up the phone and calls Trump and says, it's enough. We can't do this. We can't be living like this. These are serious times. What do I need to do to get you to stop? And the governor and president come to an agreement where if the governor stops criticizing the president of the United States on his COVID response, in return, he won't send federal troops into New York. So the book is sort of jam-packed with anecdotes like that really bring the public into our shoes on what was going on the ground politically during COVID.
And you really talk about you didn't take a break. You slept with your BlackBerry and iPhone. You were waking up at 3 a.m. to start your day, ending your day oftentimes after midnight. And then there's this fall from grace. Can you describe what that was like and what you felt? Because you could feel in the book, it was palpable that you knew how hard you were working, what you thought you were doing for Yorkers. You felt that in your core. And then to see it unravel like this, what was that like?
The only word, it's surreal. It was traumatizing and it was surreal. And as you noted before, Andrew Cuomo was lauded during the spring of 2020, I think rightly, for his leadership. If the country didn't have him during those dark days, I'm not sure what would have happened. Donald Trump was acting sort of like a deranged despot. He was trying to wish the virus away. He wasn't demonstrating any leadership, and Andrew Cuomo stepped into that de facto commander-in-chief role. And then to sort of, everything that you give to the public during those dark days, the weight of the decisions you're making, literal life and death. I bring readers on the phone with me when I'm calling healthcare workers next to him when they died, and laying on the floor and crying and feeling all of that emotional trauma and being in that uncharted territory. And then boom, fast forward 6 months later, and we're being villainized and the administration is being torn apart. And it was surreal. If I didn't live it, I'm not sure I would have believed it. And, to go through what we went through after we had given what we had given to the public for that period of time, to say nothing of the preceding 10 years, since he had been governor in total for 11 years. It's like nothing I ever could have dreamed would happen, and I don't wish it.
Do you have any regrets in that moment? What do you feel? If you could characterize your feeling right now, would it be anger, resentment? What does that look like?
I don't know that it's anger or resentment. At this point, I'm just so laser focused on trying to make sure the public understands what happened, because the consequences of what happened were so severe. A government was overturned. And I want to get out there and tell the truth, because the truth still matters. And so much of what people read in the press is not true. And making sure that people hear from primary sources what went on during those dark days, so they can, number one, decide for themselves about what happened during COVID and the year that followed. And also, I think, sort of internalize the lessons of both of those situations moving forward. So that's what my purpose is in the short term. In the long term, it's about figuring out how to help, public service, government, politics, whatever it is, continue to try to make this world a better place and give whatever I have left to the people of this city, state, and country, because I believe in government still after everything as an ultimate force of good.
It does sound like you think you still have more to give, which I do want to get to the future in a little bit. But during the book, there's these two major crises that are running parallel to each other. One being the nursing home situation and the other being the sexual harassment allegations. I first want to talk with you about the nursing home deaths. In the book, when talking about the nursing home deaths specifically, a lot of blame is assigned to everyone from Trump, the far right, the press, AG Tish James, Assemblymember Ron Kim, and others. So where do you think the responsibility lies within the Cuomo administration?
Well, to be clear, blame is not laid at any of those people's feet. I mean, this is a straight explanation of what happened. And what happened with nursing homes was Donald Trump made a very calculated decision in the summer of 2020 while he was running for president, and while COVID was the number one issue for American families across the country, because of course it was the only thing that was going on. And was killing him in the polls, literally. It was crushing him in the polls because he had done such a terrible job managing it, that he was looking for something in COVID to flip the script and go after Democrats. And so, as I explained in the book, there were 11 different states in the country that had nearly the same nursing home admissions policy from March of 2020. And yet, Trump directed the Department of Justice to go after 4 Democratic states, and the other Republican states were completely left alone. And so this is another thing I think people need to understand. The Department of Justice was weaponized by the President of the United States during the height of a presidential election in order to take heat off of him on COVID and turn it on his political rivals. And so I think that that's something that needs to come more to the forefront. People need to internalize, particularly given that Trump is running for president again. And so the book is not about blaming people. The people that made the decisions were people in the health department, people in my administration. And these were wartime decisions that were made with the best possible information, with the best possible intent. And when you separate the fact from the emotion and the politics, what you actually see in every single study that's been done is that COVID was brought into nursing homes by staff and by visitors when we were unaware of asymptomatic spread and when we didn't even know COVID was here. And so the unfortunate thing about nursing home deaths and what happened during COVID is that it was allowed to be so politicized and so weaponized. And when I look back during that period of time, I wish we could have done a better job of communicating it and trying to diffuse it much earlier, because it took the real genuine pain from families who lost loved ones during COVID. And it turned this into this political football that it never should have been. And I think made that pain worse.
To your point, and even in the book, you write, quote, nursing home deaths have become politicized and weaponized to the point of no return. And throughout the book, you really talk about the political implications of the nursing home deaths. But obviously, this transcends politics, as so much in COVID did, because thousands of families did lose a loved one when it comes to the nursing home deaths, and many of them did blame the Cuomo administration. So what is your response to them? What would you say to them?
You know, the nursing home issue was something that I feel like was never properly communicated, and it was allowed to be, as you said, and I write in the book, so politicized and so weaponized that people never even understood the facts of what happened in the nursing homes. And the reality is that the March 25th admissions policy put in place by the Department of Health was done by medical experts in consultation with other medical experts at a time when they were trying to make the best decisions they could to save as many lives as they could. And it became this political football. And we were never able to explain through the politics what actually happened. But fast forward now to today, every legitimate study that has been done that looks at how COVID got into the nursing home, not just in New York, in California, in Florida, in Michigan, in Ohio, it was all the same way. It was brought in through staff when we didn't understand what asymptomatic spread was, and we didn't really understand a lot of the facts on COVID. It was actually come in January and in February. If you look statistically, the rate at which staff was infected directly correlated to the rate at which patients were infected and subsequently died. And that wasn't specific to New York. It wasn't specific to the United States. It's something that happened globally. And so the issue of nursing homes just got so politicized and weaponized that it was able to take real people's hurt and pain and use it in the political sphere, and that should never be allowed.
And do you regret that March 25th directive that, for those who might forget, it was sending people who could be COVID positive back into nursing homes? Looking back, do you regret that? And let's say you had the opportunity to do it again. God forbid there's not another global pandemic. Would that be a directive you would do again?
You know, look, again, it's woulda, shoulda, coulda. I mean, these decisions were not made by me. They were made by the health department in consultation with other health officials. But the May 25th admissions policy, which again got so distorted in the press, was something that it said if you had been in a facility that had COVID, where there was COVID positive, you could still go back. It's still required that there be isolation. It still be required that there be PPE. It still be required that all of these other situations were in place in order to protect patients. And if you're medically stable, which is one of the requirements, if you're medically stable to leave, then the medical belief was you no longer had COVID, and so you weren't actually bringing it back. But these were the nuances in conversation that got lost in the hysteria of it. And so I'm not second guessing medical experts that made those decisions. And again, every study subsequently that's come out has shown that everywhere from New York to Florida to Texas, it came in with the staff, and it came in, through the healthcare heroes, through no fault of their own, who didn't understand asymptomatic.
Do you think that this policy, though, accelerated the spread of COVID in the nursing homes?
Look, I'm not a medical expert, but no scientific study has shown that. In fact, it's the opposite. And so again, this is one of those things that's a really easy talking bite for people on Fox News and in the New York Post, and if you want to have a political debate. But the reality is that 11 different states had nearly identical nursing home admissions policy, and there was no difference between those 11 states, including New York, including Republican states that were never at the center of Fox News for the same identical policy, and states that didn't have it, and other countries that didn't have it. And so again, I'm not a medical expert, but every single study that has come out does not point to that.
I do also want to talk about another piece of this, and this is the accusation the Cuomo administration underreported the nursing home deaths. You address this directly in the book. I'll read the quote for you. No one took note that the overall death total was always the same, or that we had always been transparent about the fact that we were counting nursing home deaths as in nursing home and hospital deaths as in hospital. Can you describe this explanation a little more for us?
Sure. So back in March of 2020, when COVID first started and we were getting no direction from the federal government, one of the things they never gave states direction on was how to report deaths. And every day we would do our press conferences and we would come back and we would give the public information. And we would put up on the screen nursing home deaths and hospital deaths. And we were always transparent from day one. The way that we were giving this to the public is that we were having the hospitals report in people who died in hospitals and the nursing homes reported people in nursing homes. And it wasn't for a month and a half, 2 months later, when the press started asking a different question, which is, what about people who have been in nursing homes and then subsequently went to hospitals and died? And so that was the question that became, again, another political football. And so as I write in the book, we end up putting out a number of different surveys in the spring and in the summer of 2020, asking the nursing homes retroactively, asking them to track down what happened to the patients after they left. And when the first, second, third onslaught of responses came in, it was a forensic nightmare. You had nursing homes saying every single patient who left died of COVID. You had people saying that every single death going back to December of 2019 were COVID patients. You had people giving dates of death in the future. And so in August of 2020, we ended up doing this big audit to try to figure out what the real numbers actually are. And then, bam, we get hit with the subpoena from DOJ to us and 3 other Democratic states after the governor criticized Trump at a convention speech. It was essentially their payback. He directed the Department of Justice to investigate us. And so we defer to the feds, and we said to the legislature, we need to give the feds what they're asking for. This is a federal investigation. This is serious. We need to deal with that first, and then we will come back to you. They said, okay. And that was what the hubbub was. It was overall deaths have never been in question. It is not questioned that from the very beginning we were very transparent that we were reporting nursing home deaths, nursing homes, hospital deaths, and hospitals for pure ease and reliability. And again, this is one of those things that if we had known that that number would have become so politicized and so weaponized, then back in March of 2020, when we were making decisions, we would have just said, this is how we should give the accounting. If we had known, 6 months later what the results.
This was a national story for months. As you know, and as you detail in the book, you lived it. You're saying there was nothing nefarious about the underreporting of the numbers. The New York...
it wasn't underreporting. It was, we always said, there's hospital deaths and nursing home deaths. And then they started to ask a second question of what about the people who left the nursing homes? So no, there was never anything nefarious. We actually gave deference to the Department of Justice, what was a totally politically motivated report directed by the White House into Donald Trump's political nemesis in his own mind. And then you fast forward to July of 2021, and DOJ actually sends us a letter confirming the numbers you gave us were proper, and there's nothing in the numbers that indicates there should be an investigation. But by then, it was too late. The die had been cast, the narrative had been hardened. This has been months of unrelenting national news cycles. And then in July of 2021, the Department of Justice comes out with this letter, and I think it was a box on page 12 of the New York Post, and everyone was moved on. And so no, there was never anything nefarious about this.
The New York comptroller did say that the Cuomo administration misled the public when it comes to these numbers. So you're refuting that. You're saying that is not true. That is not what happened.
That is not true. It's not what happened. And if that were true, then I think the Department of Justice would have had something different to say. You've got to remember the comptroller's a politician too.
But he's a Democrat, right? But you do come at Democrats as well in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Just because someone's a Democrat, I mean, LBJ famously said the only difference between cannibals and Democrats is that cannibals, don't eat their own. So there's no difference. The Democratic Party is happy to, ask Al Franken about the Democratic Party. So I don't think that anyone could say, oh, he's a Democratic comptroller. That's not really how it works.
reminds me of something that was written in the book. I can't remember off the top of my head if your dad was the one to say this or Governor Cuomo himself, that you can't trust anyone in this business. Do you still feel
It
that
was,
way?
it was, it was my father. He said that after Joe Biden called for the governor to resign. Actually, he said it to me as a child. I recalled it in that moment. No, he said, "Look, there's no friends in politics." And I mean, what's the famous quote? It's if you want a friend in politics, get a dog. So people come at things for all kinds of particular political motivations. Sometimes it's inter-party, sometimes it's cross-party lines. I actually think Republicans are much more disciplined in sort of standing by people based on party lines than Democrats have ever been. But no, this was something that was incredibly politicized, and it took real people's pain and made it that much worse. And again, if we knew that standing in the war room in March of 2020, what would have transpired, then from the very beginning we would have said, let's just didn't take it. This was about ease of reporting.
Sure, and I do now want to pivot to the other crisis that was running parallel to this, and that was the sexual harassment claims. And you spend a good time of the book dismantling these claims. Can you give us the highlight reel here?
Sure. And this is another thing that was always lost in the headlines. The headline, 11 women, where there's smoke, there's fire. And what people never saw beyond the headline was what were those 11? And 9 of the 11, which I break down in the book very methodically, you read the book, is that 9 of the 11 are things that happened in public places, in front of other people. We're talking a kiss on the cheek. We're talking a hand on the waist for a photograph. We're talking saying someone looks lovely. One of the women's complaints was that the governor had said something to her in Italian. She didn't know what it meant, but she believed it was a reference to her appearance. 3 of the women under oath said that they weren't sexually harassed. 3 of the women, didn't work for the state, so the law doesn't even apply. One of the women famously on national television, she was the doctor who was giving the governor a COVID test in May of 2020, literally head to toe PPE, looks almost like a beekeeper with a mask on, surgical mask on, and a face shield on. And the governor quipped on national television, you make that PPE look good, you make that PPE gown look good. That was one of the 11. And so the manipulation of the headline of the 11 women is that people never really looked beyond the picture. And then when you start to strip away what was, again, sort of the weaponization of everyday interaction, plain vanilla imagery, things we see politicians doing today, Joe Biden, Kathy Hochul, Tish James doing today at rallies, at events, at flood disasters, etc., you were left with really 2 or 3 what could have been more serious claims. And the reason Tish James voted up the numbers to 11 was that those 2 or 3 what could have been considered serious claims couldn't stand up. And the most serious claim was an allegation of forcible touching. It was the only one that involved touching. Was subsequently dismissed at the college. They had brought the case was dismissed because the DA identified exculpatory evidence, inconsistencies, problems across the board, and recognized that there was no jury in America that would have found the government guilty on it. And so a government was ultimately overturned. And to this day, I don't think the public understands that.
Someone who comes up pretty early in the book is Lindsay Boylan. She did work in the office, and then she was the first of the accusers. And in the book, there is a lot of decision making of should you release this personnel file of hers. And when that happened, you were accused of victim shaming. Do you think that is true?
No, it couldn't be further from the truth. And this was another thing that was both press hysteria, manufactured press hysteria, meeting politicized Attorney General's office. Lindsay Boylan lied about the terms in which she left the office. She went on Twitter and she said, he harassed me for years and everybody saw it, and I tried to quit 3 times before it stuck. I didn't sign what they asked me to. Nope. And these were just lies. And so in consultation with our lawyers, we said, are we allowed to correct the record? She's a public figure. She's lying. It's getting repeated in the press. And all of the lawyers said, absolutely, you're allowed to correct the public record. And so the personnel file demonstrated without a doubt, Lindsay Boylan left the office because she was accused of creating a hostile and toxic work environment by a number of African employees. She was confronted about this behavior. In the meeting, storms out and quits, and then 3 days later called our council and begged for her job back, wanted her job back, and we didn't give her job back. And so those things were directly relevant to the claims that she was making. And every lawyer we spoke to said, you absolutely have her well within your rights to protect the public record when someone is lying about something like that. And so that's what that was. And to this day, I feel like that happened, and then subsequently she was able to continue to say things that weren't true. She was on Twitter bullying people. She was trying to get people fired from their jobs if anyone questioned their story or said on Twitter, I support the governor. And by not sort of confronting that behavior and not calling out her mistruths, allowed her to be this one woman wrecking ball in all of these different people's lives. And up until recently, the behavior has gone unchecked. So I actually think by not holding her accountable and by pretending as if that was somehow retaliatory when what it actually was correcting the public record, allowed her sort of be able to keep going and continue to get worse and worse.
Before I move on to your future, I do have to ask, do you think Governor Cuomo behaved inappropriately at all?
I think that there have been generational changes that he perhaps did not stay in touch with. I think that things that were appropriate 10 years ago, kissing someone on the cheek, telling someone they look lovely, today, don't do it. We're in an office environment, don't do it. I think that MeToo was a very necessary corrective for a lot of reasons in terms of sort of evening power structures and letting people set their own boundaries, and people should be allowed to set their own boundaries. But that said, I don't think that those things warranted overturning a duly elected governor and calling for resignation. And before we move on this topic, I think this is really important. As a woman in the workplace who spent a lifetime in a male-dominated field and who has broken glass myself at a very young age, I think that where MeToo has lost its way, and I fear that it could end up setting women back, is that there's a certain level of hysteria around all conduct, when in reality, I think that there's a range of conduct. I think because someone on the cheek, I don't want to be kissed on the cheek. Apologize. I think that if there's some things that are chronic in the office that people feel are inappropriate, that person should be trained. More serious things, you should be fired, and others, you should go to jail. But where I think we've lost our way, and I write about this in the book, is that at least in the spring of 2021, and I've seen in other instances too, we act as though a kiss on the cheek is tantamount to sexual assault, and it gets thrown into the same pile, and people should resign. And my biggest fear is that the pendulum swings back, and people roll their eyes at the MeToo movement, and then suddenly, when there are more serious claims, they're not taken seriously because people think it's all about silly. And so I do think that there were generational shifts that he was not in touch with. Do I think that that meant that he should have had to resign and the government should be overturned? I do not.
To your point, and something that you said in the book, I want to quote and then get your reaction on it. You wrote this: Me Too twisted itself into a pretzel with a one-size-fits-all approach to allegations, despite their degree of severity. You mentioned earlier that you feel like Me Too could be swinging the pendulum away from women. So where do we go from here?
I think we have to have the conversation, and I think we have to have it honestly, and I think we have to have it with a very level head, and it needs to be driven by women. This is not a conversation that can be driven by men. But I think that there are a lot of female reporters, female opinion leaders who are doing us all a great disservice by any time a woman says, I feel uncomfortable jumping to this person is Harvey Weinstein. And I think we need to start to introduce a little bit more nuance at the top with women like you and women like me and others who are in the dialogue in a more meaningful way and acknowledge exactly what I just said. And if people disagree with me, feel free to. But again, some things apology, some things training, some things firing, some things jail. When we act like it's all Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby, you lose people. The thing that really struck me about the Johnny Depp trial was not just that people, it's fine, there's different camps, some people believed Amber, some people believe Johnny, but the vitriol online and the way, the anger and the nastiness, and you saw some of it in Kevin Spacey too, but you're seeing this swing back where now people are saying they don't believe the women. where any little inconsistency means they're a liar. And just, you know, the actual, you know, the way that the public is reacting to some of these high-profile things, I think is the canary in the coal mine for how you're going to start to see people react to them in the office and in more, you know, private settings. And so I think until women of stature start to have this conversation and sort of help lead the country through this next step, I think you could end up seeing it actually hurt women ultimately, as opposed to do what it was intended to do, which is to advance our rights.
I do now just want to talk about the present and perhaps the future. In the book, minus a few maybe minor disagreements with the governor, you do speak very highly, very glowingly of him. What is your relationship with Governor Andrew Cuomo now?
He's a good friend, and I still support him. And I think that the state was done a great disservice when our government, our administration was taken out. And now you look around and you see the migrant crisis, you see deficits that are ballooning, you see post-COVID, New York City has still not come back, too many vacant storefronts. And I think the people of New York lost. And so, as I've said before, you know, if he were to run again, I think it's time for me to chart my own course. I don't plan to work for him again, but I would support him in any way that I could.
A, do you think he's planning to re-enter politics? And B, what are your political aspirations?
I don't know if he will, but I think there's an appetite. I think that the public looks back on what happened with a more sober assessment and says to themselves, he resigned for that. And at the same time, there's a lack of leadership on every level in New York, and I think people are very nervous nationally. And so I think that if he wants to, I think that there's absolutely an opportunity for him too. And if he will, that's a question for him.
And Melissa, what's next for you? You intimated at the beginning of the conversation that you weren't quite done with politics yet, and you wrote that for 22 years you gave your blood, sweat, and tears to politics. So, are you done, or are you re-entering soon? What does that look like?
You know, I'm considering my options as well. I, you know, was the first female secretary of the governor at age 34. I held the highest unelected position in New York. I was at the helm negotiating budgets. I was, you know, at the ground floor of COVID. I was there for the infrastructure projects. I was involved at the highest possible levels, and looking around and seeing sort of the state of play right now is killing me. And I have been very critical of the current administration publicly in the media. And I also understand, you know, as someone who's been in this world for a long time, put up or shut up. Talk is cheap. So, you know, I'm considering my options moving forward, and that may take me, you know, to try to make a run for it. Who knows? But I know that I'm not done yet in public service, and what form that takes will see.
Melissa DeRosa, thank you so much for the conversation. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.